Hello and welcome back to the Jem Hawkes YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today. For our free wire tutorial here on YouTube, I'd like to share a design with you that I return to time and time again. It's a woven drop heart detailed pendant, and it's a project that you can make up with a few odd beads, some scraps, a handful of head pins, maybe a clasp where you can make your own if you're so inclined. If you'd like to join me down at the board, I'll show you one of the examples of what we're going to make today. But also, if you have odd bits and pieces, you can make a very similar design with just a handful of components that you've got left over and laying around. So this is two different chains and a couple of drop tassel beads, and a couple of lengths of wire and some chain scraps basically. So it could be a scraps project, or it could be something that you set out to make in a very specific design. Join me down at the board and we'll take a look at an example. So in the example I have on the board for you, I've chosen to work in very much mixed metals and some faceted garnet beads. Now I've used 9 approximately 6mm beads for this project, but you don't have to have these ones at the end to join the clasp. You could simply use jump rings, or you could wire yourself a clasp directly onto the chain if you prefer. I've got some scraps of gold chain, so there are 7 pieces, all exactly the same length, that I've used for the drops, and a couple of lengths that I had at the bottom of a bag to make the remainder of the pendant into a necklace. I've worked with raw copper wire with some silver colour head pins, and again you can see that it's a mixture of metals and colours, and I really like that look. However, you could choose to work in the same metal throughout. At the end of today's tutorial, what I'm going to do is show you this project side by side with the piece I'm wearing right now, which is the scrap metal project. So I'll clear the board now so we can see exactly what it is that we're going to achieve. Now obviously moving this, it's going to kind of catch on all of my wires, so I might just take that off the board altogether, to be perfectly honest. In terms of what you need for this project, if you're using scraps then all well and good, but basically we're working with 1mm or 18 gauge wire in 10 and 20 inch lengths. We'll also be working with some 0.4 or 26 gauge off the reel, and we're going to be adding in some beads as well. So I have some faceted garnet beads to hand here, which we can demonstrate with a bit later. I've also got a handful of head pins, chain scraps, a clasp, and a little bit of 0.6mm wire, just in case you want to make those end pieces. So let's get started. First and foremost, as ever, we're going to be warming our wire. Now this, to remind you, is approximately 10 inches of 1mm or 18 gauge wire. And I'm just going to give that a really lovely warm through to begin with. This is going to create the inner heart shape that we're working with today. So I'm going to find the approximate centre and put a nice deep V shape down at the bottom. If you want a sharp point in there, you can take that angle further than you need it before drawing it back out again, and you get a slightly sharper form. To set that shape, once you're happy with where the V is, you can just om-nom that with any flat facing pliers. Now, to create your basic heart shape, there are 2 ways you can do this. You can very, very simply, because we've warmed the wire, just smooth that wire around slightly. If this doesn't work for you, an alternative that you can use is to roll that around your mandrel. So if we roll that around and you do that on both sides, you can get a reasonably good heart shape. I actually prefer the slightly more natural look by using the warmth of my thumb, but it's entirely up to you. If you're looking for symmetry, then do use a mandrel to get a slightly better and more even shape. Entirely up to you. So that 10 inches of wire is the inner heart, and this is what defines the size of your piece. So this will be the inside of the piece. The outer section of wire, slightly longer this time, it's approximately 20 or so inches of wire. What we're going to do is warm the centre, and again this is 1mm or 18 gauge. We're going to warm that central section through to begin with. We're going to find the very, very middle, and we're going to create a little loop right down at the bottom. Now, because this is such a long piece of wire, it is at some point going to hit the camera, so apologies in advance. So what I'm doing is I'm using my round nose pliers down at the middle of that wire to create a loop at the base, and I can just tighten that up slightly. If I flip this up the alternative way, up the other way rather, what we're going to do is form fit that around our inner heart. Now you can just hammer that inner heart if you like, very, very lightly. I don't have my hammer to hand, but it's a very simple process. Pop that on a block and just hammer around the edges, but not the ends. And that will help you just to bring your other piece of wire up to it without deforming the shape that you've decided on. So you could do that if you like. So what we've got at the moment is a little bit of bagginess down at the base, so we need to fine up those edges, and to do that I'm just going to put my pliers in very carefully just down at the section that comes away from that loop, and just open and close slowly so that I can get some nice straight lines either side of the very bottom of that heart, and you'll see now that that fits a lot better. Now there are two schools of thought with this pendant. If I just grab it back in for a second. If you don't want to use jump rings, because jump rings that are not soldered are a weakness in any jewellery. Now I've chosen to use brass jump rings that are very, very hard indeed. They're very unlikely to come undone, and they're good quality saw cut jump rings, which means when I open and close them, my chain can't fit through the gap that is left by that saw cut. So if you have good quality jump rings, I have no hesitation that you will be fine. If you don't want to use jump rings, what you'll need to do is put your lengths of chain into each of the loops as you run through the project. We're going to make a series of loops in the outer wire as we move around the outside of that heart shape. Now, if you don't want to use jump rings, you can put your sections of chain into each of the loops as we move around the form. The issue that arises later is when you are weaving with the finer gauge wire. Every time you do a little circle of wire, it catches on a piece of chain. I know this because that's how I created this piece, because I wanted to see if it could be done. It can be done, it's just super annoying. So the choice is yours. I will show you now how to slide a piece of chain onto that loop that we've created. But my advice would be to go for heavy saw cut jump rings to add your chain in after we've completed the weaving. The choice, as I say, is entirely yours, but from my experience it's so much more preferable to just use jump rings. So what I'd like to share with you is how I section up my chain pieces before I show you how to add it onto the loop. So what you will need is the correct number of lengths of chain for you. If you're making symmetrical project like this piece, what I chose to do was take 7 pieces of chain that are all exactly the same length. Now sometimes it's really tricky to see how long a piece of chain is. What I tend to do is just use the end of my round nose pliers to drop the first cut length on, like so. Drop the second length of chain that's still attached, and just allow them to sit on my hands like so, so I can see where to make the cut. Now I can tell which link I now need to cut, so I'm just going to cut one length of chain to match the first, and then if I pop them, you can also use a piece of wire if you prefer, but let's just take the end of that length of chain, another piece of chain here, and if you drape them over your hand you can see that they are indeed the same length now. So you will need the prerequisite number of chains. I went for 7 on this one, but 5 would work. If you're using scraps, then it doesn't really matter. You just need to have 2 that are the same so that you can match them symmetrically. Again, at the end of the video, I'll show you the piece I'm wearing on the neckline now so you can see what it looks like with scraps instead. I'm going to take this back out of the way now because the wire will indeed catch on every single piece. And I'll show you how to slide one of these pieces of chain down. So all the way to one of those ends, take the very last loop of your chain, pop that onto the wire. I've got the shakes now. There we go, and just slide that all the way down until it slips just into position at the base, like so. You just push the 2 looped sections of wire back together, And then if I hold that up into position, you can see what that will look like. Now, my personal choice when making this piece is to simply add all of the chains on at the end with good, heavy, saw cut jump rings. So that is how I'm going to do it, but I just wanted to show you how you can add the chain on if you want fewer component parts that are able to fail. Don't forget, you will need to cut each of your lengths of chain. If you're going to use them from a reel of chain, then they will all need to be the same length. It's the heart shape that creates the cascade effect, not differing lengths of chain. So I'll pop that out of the way for now, and we'll move on through adding the loops to the outer of those two heart shapes. So round nose pliers for the win. You can, if you wish to, put a little bit of marker pen on one of those sides of your pliers so that you can repeat the exact same size over and over again. I'm not going to worry about it. So I'm starting about 3/4 of an inch away from that central loop, and I'm just going to rotate those pliers around part of the way, like so. I'm going to try and drop that down a little bit closer to the board so it's in better focus. And then I'm going to draw that tail all the way around before removing those pliers and just drawing that all the way around. Now, the reason I'm struggling is because I've got long lengths of wire here, but I want to show you that in focus. So there we go. Let's draw that all the way around and along. The key part of this technique is that we want to have a flat line along the base, and you can see that right now that is not a flat line. So I'm going to re-warm the wire that I've just slightly tensed out, like so. So warming it and smoothing it in one go. I'm then going to come back in with my bent chain nose pliers to just support the loop on that line whilst pressing up and then re-straightening that wire around it. And you can see it doesn't take much effort just to get that loop super straight on its wire that acts as the base. So you can see that we've fitted that nicely to the inner heart shape. So we now need to put a loop on the other side. So again, I'm struggling because there's so much wire, and also because there's a camera just a couple of inches above what's happening on the board right now. So what I want to do is to create an element of symmetry. So hopefully you can see that the heavy wire has coiled around underneath before coming up in a spiral over the top. So I want to repeat that if I can, which means that we're going to warm the wire on the other side. I'm going to start a little bit further away and rotate the pliers around, allowing that wire to just form into a nice loop shape. And then you can just move it ever so slightly so that the loop sits at the same position away from the central base loop. You might need to just do that by hand. And again, we're going to re-warm that next section of wire. Before utilising the bent chain nose, you can use chain nose if you prefer, just to get that loop to sit flat, and then straighten up the tail that's coming away. Now, that loop is slightly further along than this loop, so we need to roll the loop along. And to do that, we're going to put the round nose pliers into the wire, rotate them around until the loop sits in the correct position. I'm just going to straighten that up slightly. Come back in with those bent chain nose pliers, hold the loop, and then re-straighten that wire. We can then just straighten the section that comes away, re-warm, and turn that back to its correct orientation. Now you can see that the wire is symmetrical on both sides, in so much as it's come away from that central loop at the bottom, it's rotated around in a coil, not a coil, a curl, sorry, and then the tail of wire is on top. Tail of wire is on top, so we're operating in a symmetrical fashion. Now that may not matter to you, but it matters to me, so I'm just going to make sure that that loop sits exactly where I want it to, and that it is indeed the same size as the first loop. So you may need to just refine that very, very slightly. And again, you can bring that wire back to straight fairly quickly and fairly easily before operating a little bit of body warmth onto the wires and checking to see if we're following the form of our inner heart. Now we're just going to repeat that exact same process another couple of times. So this works with odd numbers of chains, odd numbers of beads. to give you a central section. If you didn't want to have an odd number, then it's going to look ever so slightly different in the final project, and you would need to just have a hard bend down at the bottom. My preference is to make this symmetrically, so therefore with an odd number of loops, an odd number of chains, and an odd number of dangling beads. So what I'm going to do now is repeat the loop section another 2 times, coming up the side of the heart, and then I'm going to start forming that wire around. So I've taken a couple of moments just to add some extra loops on either side, so now I have a total of 7 loops, including that base one right down in the V shape of that heart. So if you'd like to join me back at the board, I'll show you where we're going to go next. So you can obviously take a little bit more time to make sure that your edges are super straight, that your loops are all the same size, and that they're opposite each other in a lovely symmetrical fashion. Now with my inner heart, I'm just going to take those tails and just bring them up slightly so they're out of the way. And I'm going to hold the 2 forms side by side. So what we're going to do now is start to bring those end wires all the way around so that they match the shape of that heart. And just make sure that we're not taking up too much or too little of the wire. I think I might show you one side at a time. So once you've got those 2 pieces, an inner frame and an outer frame, lined up, we're going to decide how we're going to attach the chain at the shoulders of the design. So what I'm going to do is add another loop right up at the top corner, and then repeat it on the other side once I've got that shape and size set in my mind. So I'm going to now drop the inner frame out of the way, draw the wire around, and again this is much easier when there isn't a camera above. Pop that central wire back in, allow that to sit inside your looped section, and then start bringing the tail around as well. And because you warmed this wire before we started the project, you should be pretty solid on how that's going to bend for you. So for the time being, we're just going to allow that to swoop away at the top, like so. What I might do is take this second side of the heart and push it underneath, because it makes life so much easier when we're doing our weaving section. So we've got one side coming up, both wires are coming slightly up, and then on the other side, once I go round this edge, add a little bit of warmth to get the fluidity in. What we're going to do now is add a loop in to match on the left hand side of the heart. So we want to estimate whereabouts that's going to go, and I would say probably just about here. So if I pop my finger into position and then just allow those pliers to loop all the way around, like so, trying to get them to match in terms of size and shape. That might need to go just a little bit further out to the side. Bring the heart back into position. And then this tail I'm going to take down so that it matches the tail on the left hand side, like so. That looks reasonably equal and opposite to me. I think actually maybe I need to move that loop just a little bit further to the left. And the beauty of warming your wire and with working with raw copper is that you do have an opportunity to do this a couple of times. But push that tail of wire back so that it continues along to form the other side of that heart. If you need to, you can just draw that around with the pliers instead of by hand. And we'll just get that to match up with the inner frame. It looks reasonably close to me. I might need to take that slightly tighter, push that down. So there's a lot of wires that you're looking at all in one go, but the basic idea is that we've formed 7 loops for the chains to fall from. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then we've got a loop on either shoulder which we're going to attach chain to form the main necklace component later. So hopefully that is all as clear as it can possibly be. Let me just slide my hand in like so, so you can see the half by itself. That's better. So you've got the long tail of wire coming up on the right hand side with the short inner framework coming up as well. And then on the back, things are going downwards instead. And that's going to help us when we're going to do the weaving in just a moment. So as I mentioned earlier on, weaving with the chains in place is something of a tricky nature, and it might make you cry, or it might make you swear, or it might make you not want to do the tutorial. So we're going to weave without any chain in position. We're going to add the chain on at the end with heavy saw cut jump rings of a nice quality. So if you join me back down at the board, we're going to get to do the weaving part now. For our next part of the tutorial, we're going to be working with a finer gauge wire. I've chosen raw round copper in 0.4 or 26 gauge. And this can be something of a challenge if you're brand new to wire, but it isn't a difficult technique. So for you to have enough wire to do this in one go, you'd need to unspool about 4 feet, about 48 inches, 1.2 meters, I want to say. Is that enough? That sounds about right. It's a lot of wire. So what I tend to do is try to break the sections down. I'll unspool about a foot and I'll start weaving about 1/4 of the way around. So this is where we would need to start the weaving, all the way around, down to the centre, up the other side and back around. So if we start 1/4 of the way in and unspool about 1/4 of the wire we need, it's just marginally less tricky. I've just caught all of the chain over here, never mind. So what we're going to do to begin with is to put the outer frame down and out of position to begin with, remembering where we want to start, which is about halfway up on the right hand side. So to begin with, what I'm going to do is wrap 5 times around the point on the right hand side of the heart. If you're left dominant, it's merely a case of inverting it. And I'm going to wrap 5 times. Every time I wrap a coil, I'm supporting the long tail of wire that comes away to the reel over here on my left. If you're left dominant, you would probably want to do this in the opposite direction and start on the other side. Every time I wrap a coil of wire around the heavier frame, I'm going to neaten it up. So that's 3, push that down into position. If you value your nails, you can very gently push that down with some flat facing pliers. Now what you'll notice I'm doing here is I'm taking a loop of wire, I'm drawing it over the end and pulling the tail of the wire down. So that is the 4th loop, loop around and a 5th loop. Now if you don't want to do that, you can post the end of the wire down through this part of the heart. I find that super annoying and slow, so that's not the way that I do it. The next thing we're going to do is bring our heart into position. Now, to get this to sit where you want it to sit, it's a bit like putting a key in a lock. You can see we've got a finer tail of wire coming over the top on the left side, which is leading to the reel, and underneath on the right hand side, which is leading to the cut end. So what we need to do is to insert into position where we want it. So I'm going to draw the outer framework of heart. Sorry. I'm going to pull just the end of the right hand side into position and just slot the heart shape into the centre. What we're looking to achieve, and we'll zoom in for this section, is to get the wire that's coming underneath the inner frame wire to also go underneath the outer looped section. The finer wire that's coming over the top of the inner frame needs to come over the top of the outer frame. So once we've got that into position, and I'm just going to line it up by one of these loops, I'm going to pinch that section very, very firmly. What we're going to do now is wrap twice around both the inner and the outer frame. Now again, you can loop that around both of these ends of wire, like so. So it draws all the way around both inner and outer wire. If you prefer, you can take the tail of the wire we're working with down through the centre of the inner heart, grab that tail and draw it around. You're doing the same thing whichever technique you choose. So before bringing the tail of wire up now, we've done 2 wraps around the inner and the outer. So what we need to do now is just wrap that inner frame wire 5 times. So I've brought the tail of wire up in between the 2 frames inner and outer. I'm going to push that into position neatly. What I'm going to do now is loop around the inner frame wire only and go for 5 wraps. Now that's caught, so I'm just going to give that a bit of a squish. So there's 1 wrap, 2 wraps, squish that up neatly, 3 wraps, squish that up neatly, 4 wraps. Again, what we're going to do is make those really neat and tidy. You could, if you prefer, push the tail through, drag it all the way down and then reinsert it up between them. It's entirely up to you. Now we've completed our 5 wraps around the inner frame. We're going to go for 2 wraps around both of them. Now at this stage you've still got a bit of movement. You can waggle the inner frame and the outer frame separately from one another. So what we need to do is make sure that the V of the inner frame is sitting entirely in the V right down at that first loop we created of the outer frame, and then we're going to pinch that firmly while we continue in exactly the same pattern. Now if you notice any sections which are not perfectly how you want them to be, now is a good time to just adjust that ever so slightly and make sure that you're happy with the forms that your wire has taken. So it's now 2 wraps around both of those frames. That's 1 and that's 2. Push that into position and neaten it up. Then I'm going to take the tail of that wire and post it up between the frames so that we can now wrap again 5 times around just the inner frame wire. So you're just going to continue this hopefully until you get past that last loop. If you run out of wire, don't fear. Finish off on a 2 or a 3 wraps on the single inner frame wire and then just add more. It's not a problem at all. However, my preference is to have as few additions as possible, working with 1 long strand if you possibly can. So what I'm going to do now is complete a little bit of weaving until I get to the end of my 12 or so inches of that fine wire. So what I've done is just continued with that 12 inches or so that I unspooled from the reel, and I've woven that in a 5 and 2 weaving pattern around the heart. It's taken me as far as the loop we made at the shoulder to add the chain on. So I'd like to show you how to continue in the opposite direction on the reel now, and one of the challenges that you might face, but it is very, very worth it if you possibly can continue to weave with a single length of wire. The finish that you achieve is really beautifully neat. If you wish to work in a series of smaller lengths of that lighter gauge wire, then absolutely do. There is always a way. If your wire snaps, if you run out of wire, if you misjudge how much that you need, you can always add a little bit in if you need to, or just simply do it in a lot of 12-inch lengths if it's too much to handle in one great big go. So let's have a look at what I've managed to do so far, and I'll show you how to continue in the opposite direction now. So on the right hand side we started just about halfway up between the bottom V shape and the upper section, and this is what 12 inches of weaving wire looks like. This again is 0.4 or 26 gauge. So I've wrapped 5 times around the inner heart and then twice around both the inner and the outer frames, and I've taken that pattern all the way around as far as the shoulder on the top. That's where my wire ran out. It's good because it gives me an opportunity to show you how to add more. It also gives me the opportunity to tell you that if you want to do this in one great big long length of wire, then you're going to need slightly more than I thought. I thought that 4 foot or 120 centimetres of wire would be enough to go all the way around the entire frame. Apparently it's not quite enough. So you're probably going to need around 6 feet of wire, which is something like too much maths for me in one day. It's a lot of wire to use. So I'm going to show you now how to continue with your wire that's attached to the frame and the reel in the opposite direction. Now this again is just a tad fiddly. It's not unachievable. So I'm trying to orient the heart in such a way that you'll be able to see where I'm taking the tail of wire. Again, the wire that's coming away is 0.4 or 26 gauge, and this is the side that's attached to my great big kilogram reel of wire. So I'm going to show you how to wrap 5 times around that inner heart frame, and what I'm going to do is very, very gently open out the design so you can see all the different places that we're working with. So we've already started on the one side, that's all tied together. So what we're going to do now is take the tail of the wire, we're going to loop it over the V base of the inner frame, Just going to push that down in between those two, in between the outer and the inner frame, and just bring that nice and tightly up on that inner frame wire. So that's once. I'm going to take that tail around again, push the leading edge loop in, 2. Got to draw the tail of wire around, push the leading edge through. You can use your thumbnail to guide if you want. So that's 3 completed visual wraps, 4 completed visual wraps, and it will catch on the loops that we've created. And then that's the 5th completed visual wrap on the inner frame wire. Get that nice and neat and tidy because you can't do it later. So you can see we've wrapped 5 times around that inner frame. So now we're going to go twice around both of them. And I'm just going to scooch that up with my pliers to make it neat and tidy. Draw the tail of wire that's attached to the reel all the way around both the inner and the outer. So that's 1 and that's 2. That's a much easier manoeuvre to do. Tighten those 2 coils up. Pull it nice and firmly before continuing on by wrapping around the inner frame heart only. So that's 1, that's 2, fiddly but not difficult, 3, take the loop all the way around the end, 4, and then the 5th time, all the way around the end. Tighten up those coils so they're neat and tidy, and then we're going to wrap twice around both of them. That's the easy part, so pull a little bit of tension into there, into that tail of wire, once and twice, tension again before tightening up that double coil, and then we're just going to loop around that V base on the inside again. So that's 1, that's 2. And it does become quicker once you know the route that your tail of wire has to take. So I'm going to slow it down for the last time. The tail of wire is attached to the reel and to your frame project. We're going to loop it around the base of the inner heart, push it down, and then draw the tail up and around. Tighten those up before going for a double wrap around both of those sections. I've slightly pulled that outer frame out of position, so I'm just going to give that a bit of a squeeze and get that to sit neatly by sliding those 2 up inside the frame. All you will do is continue until you get all the way around to the other shoulder, and at that point you can decide if you want to just continue weaving down to the point where these 2 sections meet. So as I said, I ran out of wire with the foot that I unspooled, so you might wish to unspool slightly more if you want to do it in one hit. What can happen is that it's just a little bit tricky and you may prefer to do this in multiple small sections. When you get to the V at the bottom, I would finish with 2 wraps around both of them, and then simply cross over to 2 wraps around the other side. If you want to fill the base of the inner heart with single wraps, you absolutely can. But in my experience, just those 2 little wraps going on, first on the right hand side as it is in its proper orientation, and then 2 on the left hand side before returning to your 5 and 2, 5 and 2, 5 and 2 routine all the way around. So you obviously don't want to watch me doing that for like an hour, so I will see you back here in a second. So I've continued with the weaving in exactly the same pattern, 5 around the inner and then 2 around both, all the way to the base of the heart and then back up the other side and all the way around past the shoulder loop to the centre where the 4 strands of wire cross over in the middle. If you'd like to join me back at the board, I'll show you exactly what I mean, and I'll also show you how to add on if you misjudge your length of wire or if your wire snaps part of the way through the process. So you can see I wove all the way down to the base and then up and around the edge to the point at which all of the wires cross over. So whenever you get to a loop, it's pretty easy to just weave in exactly the same fashion, and if you need to scooch the wire over slightly, you absolutely can. There's no drama to having those loops there. Now, if you run out of wire or your wire snaps, this is what you will need to do to finish it off. So you can see I had enough to do 2 wraps around both, and then I think I've got 3 or 4 little wraps down there already. So I'm just going to re-warm the wire, as it's been a little while since this was warmed, just to turn this up so that I can see correctly. And I'm going to grab myself probably another 12 or so inches of that finer gauge 0.4 26 gauge wire. Now the ideal would be is if you finish off, you will need to just reverse slightly so that you've just got, there are 3 visible wraps, so that's absolutely fine. Have 2 or 3 visible wraps on the inner frame wire so that you can wind on with 2 or 3 good strong wraps as well. The idea is that it looks imperceptible to the eye. You can see that there are still 5 wraps going around the inner before you continue in the opposite direction. So I've wrapped on a couple of loops just here, a couple of coils rather. I'm going to trim away that end and just tidy that up neatly with my bent chain nose pliers, and then slide that round to the position that we will need it at. So just reorienting the design so that I can hold it more smoothly. So what we're going to do now is continue as if we didn't misjudge, if we didn't snap the wire or any of those things happened. So right now we can decide which side we want to bring the to, and I think I'll hit the camera and then take it to the right of that loop. Bring that all the way around. Get your 2 wraps in with a little bit of tension, not too much to begin with because you might undo your wraps. And then start by pushing that over sideways rather than pulling the end. And then you can simply continue in exactly the same way as you were before. So that would be to loop around the inner 5 times now. If you find that your wires are a little bit tight, you can very gently open them out, but it's small movements rather than big exaggerated bends in the wire. We're just teasing that so that it comes apart slightly rather than forcing it. Once you've got your 5 little loops on there, you can bring that back down again and continue until you meet in the middle with your other side, which should be all nice and neat and tidy, and 5 2 wrapped all the way around. So I'll just quickly finish this off so it matches, and I'll join you back in a second. So we have finally finished our woven heart centre. And what we're going to do is trim away just a little bit of this excess wire, but not overly much, in case you want some nice flourishing hearts. The only reason I'm taking some of it now is that it's much easier to deal with when you don't have huge, great big long swathes of wire. You've still got enough to make a flourish there. So what we need to do is to connect this in a very strong way in the centre. One thing I should mention is that I've finished on 5 wraps on the inner on both sides. What this means is that there's a good strong connection between the fine wire and the heavy frame wire. If you finish on a wrap that goes around 2 wires, it will come loose no matter how tightly you bind it. So what we're going to do now is to take the section that we had on the right, which I brought forwards. I'm going to bend that so that it goes backwards and through underneath the left hand side. So what I'm going to do is grip just above where my final coils of wire are, just open this out slightly and start by bending that through gently to begin with so that the tails are going through. And then I'm going to move the pliers to almost the end of the coils, but not quite, and try to push quite a firm bend through. It doesn't really matter what the angle is right now because we're going to play with that in a minute. The point is that the wires that are coming from the end on the right hand side are going through to the back. What we need to do now is the equal and opposite. So what we're going to do is take the wires that are coming from the left hand side, and in reverse we're going to bring them forward. So I might just warm that first slightly and just put a gentle bend in to get the main body of the wire up and through before reforming the heart shape, gripping along the coiled section and just pushing that up at a slightly sharper bend as well. So those 2 points are going to meet, mesh together and make a very strong connection. So what I think I will do is this 1 wire by 1 rather than trying to force it all in at the same time. So I'm just going to grab one of the wires that's come from the left. As it happens, it's the upper wire, which is the slightly longer one. And I'm going to wrap that all the way around the woven section on the right-hand side of that heart. So I'm going to bring that round twice and then back through before tightening up those coils and making sure that we have a good, strong connection. The reason being is that this is going to form an integral part of a finished piece of jewellery, and we don't want that to come undone. So basically that is our first good strong connection, like so. The next one we're going to do is to take one that was coming from the right hand side, is looping down below. It goes through on the left, and I'm going to pull that sharply up and around. If I turn that upside down now, I'm going to do the exact same thing as we did on the first side. Push that into position and crimp it. Now everything else is kind of extra to what you need. So we're just going to make these into some coils. One of my coils I'm going to sit over this very central part. The second wire that came from the right hand side down into the left, I'm going to pull that behind the design and just push it up in the air for now. Just need to make sure that there's not too much bulk in that central area there. If there is, it can be uncomfortable. So I'm just going to re-sight that slightly and draw it over. And then I think I might bring that down and over the front. So that's travelled all the way around and then back down to the front so that I can pinch this section and it's not uncomfortable. What we're going to do now is just turn some loops with these pieces. So this central wire here is the last piece that hasn't had anything done to it yet. It's one that's come from the left hand side. It's the inner heart section. So what I'm going to do is grab my round nose pliers, start making a coil. In fact, what I do need to do is actually just trim that with the flush cutter to make sure that they're all neat and tidy. The rest of them were, I just missed that one. Naughty, naughty. So I'm going to, again, grip that with the round nose pliers and start creating a coil shape. You can see that's starting to loop around. Grab my chain nose pliers, because I dropped my bent chain nose pliers on the floor, obviously, because it's me and I'm clumsy. Continue creating that coil shape and then sight it over the central mass of that piece, just to cover up any of those gubbins. Everything else is kind of extra, and you can just add loops and swirls to your heart's desire. Let me just grab the demonstration piece, which is obviously in knots already. One thing I would say is this is really pretty to look at with these extra long pieces of chain, but it's very fancy in wear. You would definitely need quite a dipping neckline if you were going to wear this. Absolutely beautiful as window decor or wall art though. However, in wear, I would probably go for slightly shorter chains. You can vary the size of the beads that you use. I'm just demonstrating with 6mm round faceted garnets. They fit nicely on my chosen headpins, which are heavyweight headpins rather than the ultralight ones, which are a little bit snappy, to be perfectly honest. So you can vary the length of the chains if you want to, but it's the shape of the heart using the same length chains that creates this beautiful flowing graduation. What I wanted to show you was the central section here, which is where all the swirls and flourishes are. Now I will continue and just finish this piece off very quickly. You've been with me for a very long time today, so let's just add some quick flourishes to this design, and then I will show you how to add on sections to create the chain. So this is quite a small section of wire, so we're just going to go for really quite a small curl, and that's just going to sit beneath the woven section. We worked quite hard on doing all this weaving. You really can't see very much where we added on, so I'm not overly worried about that. This is quite a long segment of wire that we've got to play with here. So again, round nose pliers. I might drop this down into the middle of the design. Start by creating a round form with your round nose pliers. Squish that nice and flat so it doesn't catch on anything in wear. And then the tension is basically in this manoeuvre. So I'm twisting the pliers round so that it draws the coil onto the rest of the wire. And in that way you can get quite a neat coil. I'm just going to allow that one to sit down just there, I think. Doesn't matter if it's symmetrical or not, unless you want it to be, in which case you do you. So this one I think I'm just going to loop over the top and draw it down into the body of the design. kind of doing this bit on the fly, to be quite honest. So opening and closing, and then, yeah, I think I actually quite like it like so. So that's the piece that we've made together today. You can spend a little bit more time than I have making sure that all of your loops are perfectly symmetrically spaced. When you're happy with everything, we're just going to give it a little bit of a straighten up. Now you'll notice I'm very, very gently using my pliers here. I don't want to put any stress where wires cross over each other. And just a little gentle application of pressure where the fine gauge wire sits over the heavy gauge wire. Now you do, because we've used 18 gauge or 1mm, you do have the possibility to just move things around a bit. If you didn't like that coil where I set it, you can set it wherever you want to. I think I prefer it sitting down like so. So what I'm going to show you now is how to add on a piece of chain. Now to add on chain at the shoulders, it's exactly the same technique with opening and closing a jump ring and adding the chain. To add a head pin charm drop with a bead down at the bottom of a piece of chain, what we're going to do is first of all create a right angle bend just above the bead. Garnet's nice and sturdy to work with. Then we're going to switch to our round nose pliers. Now any straight pliers will give you that lovely bend. Going to rotate the wire from that head pin around, leaving a slightly open access point. I'm going to grab one of my measured pieces of chain, cut them and get them prepared before you do the rest of your tutorial so you don't have to faff around with them later. And then what we're going to do is grip across the circular form that we've made and complete a wrapped loop. Now I'm trying to do this without putting my hands in front of the camera. I'm just going to coil that around until the space is filled. Use those flush cutters again to cut away. Now sometimes, dependent on the length of your head pin, you may find use for these offcuts. If they're precious metal, either reuse that section of wire or put it in a recycling pot so it can be melted. Don't just let it go to waste. With the tail of the head pin, which has formed our wrapped loop, wrong pliers, what we're going to do is just gently squeeze that down until it sits flat and flush and you filled the gap between the loop and the bead itself. The bead shouldn't be spinning overly much, but you shouldn't want to put too much pressure on it. So what I'm going to do is open my head pin, my jump ring. Now I've only got one pair of pliers because the others went on the floor. So when you open your head pin, crikey, I've done it again. When you open your jump ring, using two pairs of flat pliers is much easier when you're working with such heavy jump rings as I am today. And then it's just a case of inserting it into the loop and closing it up. Now obviously not having the right pliers is going to be a bit problematic, so I'll just grab a different pair just here and hope that they will be sufficient. They're a bit chunky for the job, to be honest. Opening and closing jump rings like so. Yeah, that's a little bit of a squish and a squeeze, and you can see that using a very heavy jump ring like this one will add strength and beauty to the design rather than a point of weakness. You can, as I say, put the chains in as you're moving around the design, but it's a bit tricky when you're doing all that weaving. It's not the easiest thing in the world to undertake. So you would repeat that again. Let me grab the other piece. Here we go. So that's what it will look like once you've added all 7 or all 5 of your gemstone bead chain drops with that woven cluster in the centre. Let's draw that down. For the chain coming away at the neckline on this piece, I did add them in whilst I was doing the weaving, and it was a pain, a massive, massive pain. But it means there's no place where this can falter or misfunction. Is that the word? I don't think it is. So that's the chain itself. Up at the top, I added an oversized clasp with a little bit of rosary linking up at the top, which there's a dedicated video for if you want to see that. Right from the beginning of when I launched my channel in 2019, so you'll have to forgive the graphics. There we go. That's what we have made together today. And that's the demonstration piece that I finished this morning before recording. So you can see it does take a little bit of time, and we used probably in the end around about 6 feet, 72 inches I want to say, of that 0.4 or 26 gauge wire. So it's quite wire hungry despite not being a huge piece. Well, thank you for hanging out with me today. I know it's been quite a long tutorial. I hope you enjoy it. I shared an image of this design from many years ago on Facebook the other day. Lots of people loved it, so I thought I would share the nuts and bolts of how to make your very own. If you have any questions, drop me a comment. Otherwise, I'm going to take a photograph of this, which is a bit of an odds and ends piece, but it follows the same directive. I'll take a photograph of that now and pop it on the board for you to look at on the outro. Have yourself a lovely day, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye for now.